Sit down. Be quiet. Raise your hand. No talking. See, the smell of my classroom is noxious, like chemical weapons dropped on civilians by dictator regimes. I guess there's not much civil about civil wars, conflicts, or classrooms. It's all just combat for contract. Symptoms of the condition develop shortly after contact, like amnesia. Taking us back to some time before 1954, pre-Brown versus Board of Education, the smell is reminiscent of Plessy versus Ferguson. See, this classroom is just the size of hopelessness. And it makes sense. Schoolhouse doors have often been carved into cookie-cutter formations shaped just right for cultural assimilation. Imagine, single-filed into a room with no windows, one door, desks bolted to the floor, chairs attached to just the right size to fit only one body type. Force to face forward, for this is the only important direction. Pay attention. Sit down. Be quiet. Raise your hand. No talking. Face forward. Eyes on your own paper. Don't talk to your neighbor. Can you hear our subtext? See, our expectations started with your 4th grade test scores. Your lowered reading level, the reason the city built a detention facility across the street, a constant reminder of where your future is headed, because this has never been about you. It has always been about business, so go ahead. Open your textbook. Here you will read one version, and only one version of history, where we've removed all of the faces that don't look like me, revised any names hard to pronounce from my tongue, whitewashed your history to let you know exactly where you came from, where you were enslaved from. And then we made martyrs of your heroes because children, well, they learn best by example. Limited discussion of your histories to one day or month of the year, and even these 3rd graders can understand the value of that fraction. See, these fractured factions of our history are conveniently left out of the narrative that sounds more like some Disney fairy tale, assembled from these American dreams, or maybe it was stereotypes, made manifest in this prefabricated destiny, manifestation of symptoms chemically induced from inhaling these fumes. See, our eyes are blurry with disappointment. Our throats are choking on lies and somebody else's good intentions. We are tired of finding sanity in gas masks, our breath too short to reach the ends of our own mouths. Cardiac arrest is imminent. Just call it generational consequences of being immigrants. Sit down. Be quiet. Sit down. Be quiet. Sit down. Sit down. Sit down. How will we learn to stand for anything? Thank you all. All right, so spoiler alert, that was not my entire talk. But that was a spoken word poem of mine titled This Olfactory. And as you can tell, it starts to address some of the ways in which our public education systems seem more interested in enforcing discipline than on creating effective models of learning. And I think in a country where a young woman in South Carolina can be brutalized by a school resource officer simply for not following directions, we have to ask ourselves, how important are the directions? And then it comes out afterwards. This young woman is actually in the foster care system and clearly experiencing some family turmoil, and I wonder if anyone at that school asked her that day how she was doing, or if the people in charge cared more about telling her to sit down, be quiet, and pay attention than on the well-being of the students in front of them. And that's what I want to talk about here. See, the two largest problems that I see facing students in public education today, so both at the high school as well as here at the college level, the two largest problems that I see students facing are a lack of voice and a lack of connection. So by connection, I'm talking about connection to their communities of learning, their peers, their teachers, their administrators, even the physical spaces they learn in. And by voice, I think most students are made to feel as if their voices don't matter. I mean, we can tell that easily when looking at polling data of who votes the most often, and it is not young people. But especially in the classroom, I think students are told that the things they have to say don't matter and don't make a difference. And that's a problem. So tonight, I want to talk to you all about the power of spoken word poetry and how I believe deeply that spoken word, along with other creative and performative arts, has the power to really start addressing these two areas of needs for students. Spoken word can empower young people with their own voices, and it can start building these connections between students and the communities that they live in. So to give you a little background about me, I have been writing poems since about the 3rd grade, when I started turning in poems instead of essays in my language arts classes. And it didn't work out that well for me. But it has been going a lot better lately. And so I have been teaching spoken word poetry workshops in Pinellas County high schools for about the last 4 years. It started out on a volunteer basis because I was really passionate about spoken word, and I just wanted to share it with students who felt the same way. But I then realized how powerful of a curriculum tool that spoken word can be. So not just in addressing literacy skills development, but also in addressing some social needs of students who are experiencing feelings of isolation or bullying in their schools. And so now, thanks to a grant by the Pinellas Education Foundation and sponsorship from Transamerica, I now have the privilege to teach spoken word poetry in over 10 different high schools and alternative programs for youth here in Pinellas County. And that is amazing. So the students I work with, they come from a lot of different backgrounds. Some of them are those straight-A overachievers, but some of them are also contemplating dropping out because their schools are just not reaching them. But regardless of the issues they struggle with, whether it's addiction or a juvenile record in the school-to-prison pipeline, maybe it's their gender identity or their sexual orientation, their ethnicity, their race, their age, their faith, it doesn't matter. Regardless of background, they all write about the same things. They write about feeling lost, they write about feeling alone, and ultimately they write about feeling disconnected from the world around them. But amazingly, when given a safe space to express themselves and a platform from which to speak on issues that matter to them and an audience willing to give them positive affirmation, every single one of them experiences some level of transformation. So I want to give you an example of what this looks like. So a few years ago, I was doing a performance at Gibbs High School, which is right down the street from here. And after the performance, there was a little bit of time left in the class period, and students were really excited to share, so it turned into this impromptu open mic. And I'll never forget this one young woman who steps up to share. She is this tiny 9th grader who's incredibly nervous, but she reads this heart-wrenching poem about the bullying that she was experiencing in that very school. And now I think that's incredibly brave of someone that young to be able to stand up in front of their peers and talk about some personal issues like that. So her peers are giving her tons of positive feedback, even when she stumbles over her words, and you can tell that she's just on a high, walking off stage. And so as she's walking back to her seat, this one young man in the audience stands up, walks over, gives her a fist bump, and says, "Yo, I felt that." And I find out afterwards that this young man was one of her largest bullies. But because of the power of spoken word poetry, this young woman was able to express herself and empower herself with her own voice in front of her peers. And this young man was able to experience this positive moment of connection between himself and someone that I bet he thought he had nothing in common with. And that's the power of spoken word poetry. So build this with me just a little bit further. I want to tell you about one of my favorite workshop activities, and it's called I Live Here. And I've borrowed it from James Cass, who is the executive director of a national nonprofit called Youth Speaks. And every summer they put on an international poetry festival and slam competition just for teenagers. So James was facilitating a session on workshop pedagogy for coaches and leaders, and he used this workshop activity. And it asked some great questions that I want to ask you all to reflect on as well tonight. So the first one, what does it mean to be alive? Are you thinking about it? Where are you most alive? And then who are you when you are most alive? So I think these are really powerful questions to ask ourselves because we don't do it often enough. And I think there are really powerful questions to ask young people, because we certainly don't ask young people these questions often enough. So I've been doing this particular workshop across all of the schools and programs I work in with over 100 different students, and overwhelmingly, the results are the same. Not one of these students feels most alive in their classrooms. Now, almost all of them do indeed say that learning is part of this feeling of what it means to be alive, but not one of them feels most alive in their classroom. Now, I did this very same workshop here at USF St. Pete with my first-year composition students, and there's about 100 of them as well. And the results were exactly the same. They all valued learning as part of what it means to be alive in the world, but not a single one of them felt most alive in their college classrooms. And I think that this is the greatest disservice that we could possibly do to young people. So when we tell them to sit down, be quiet, and pay attention, we're giving them the message that their voices don't matter. Now, one educational theorist by the name of Paulo Freire, in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he calls this the banking model. And in the banking model, teachers know everything and students know nothing. In this model, it grows students who are disinterested and disengaged and ultimately disempowered from the communities they exist in. And I think that we need to grow students in the exact opposite direction. And that is what spoken word can do. It can help create spaces that are safe for students to express themselves freely. It can give them public platforms to speak on issues that matter to them so they get to figure out what they care about and how they intersect with the meaning of the world. You know, I think about my ideal student, and I imagine this young person who is alive and curious and engaged, who has great questions and who has meaningful contribution to the conversations of our classrooms, and that all sounds great, right? But then I have to think about who the adult is here. Who is setting the tone of our classrooms? Not one of my college students felt most alive in the classroom. And that's on me. That is on us as educators. See, I think we need to start critically examining the ways in which we are building spaces for young people to be most alive and to express themselves freely. And then we have to recognize that if we are not intentionally doing that, if we're not doing that, then we are actively diminishing their voices. I reflect on all of the young people that I have the privilege to work with. Many of them come from families who have immigrated here recently. Some of them come from parents who never finished college, or some parents who have never finished high school. And all of these young people are realizing for the first time in their lives the power of their own voices and how they can start creating a better world for themselves. They can join school clubs and organizations where they get to talk about issues that affect them personally, and then they get to change those issues. They get to perform on public platforms like a district-wide poetry slam here in Pinellas County, or over in Tampa at the Tampa Museum of Arts. This last Gasparilla Fringe Festival, poets were performing surrounded by Norman Rockwell paintings, and they got to talk about issues of racial disparity in their neighborhoods and desegregation. And perhaps most powerfully of all, students can use their voices to earn themselves a free ride scholarship to go to college. You know, it is an amazing, moving thing to watch a young person growing into themselves for the first time, where they discover the power of their own voice and they realize that their voice can take them anywhere they want to go. And that is the power of spoken word poetry. Thank you all so much for your time.